Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Holman, and I am the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. I'd like to thank you for taking time today to join us for our webinar, Using Variation and Comparisons to Assess Dyslexia. Today, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Jeremy Grant. Dr. Grant is an assistant professor of school psychology and a nationally certified school psychologist. He has a doctorate in school psychology from Teachers College at Columbia University. He has spent the last several years training in both educational and clinical settings. He has a passion for social justice and desires to bridge racial, ethnic, and cultural gaps in education to ensure equitable outcomes for all students. We're excited to welcome you today to learn how you can use the referral question to guide your selection of appropriate variation and comparison procedures. During the presentation, please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. A recording of today's presentation and certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants by the end of next week. The recordings from our previous webinar can also be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/clinicalbd. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Grant.
Thank you, Dr. Holman, and good afternoon, morning, depending on your time zone, but a good day, everyone. So today, what I'm going to be leading you all through is a bit more of a targeted discussion regarding the variation and comparison procedures that are available using the WJ4. And a couple of weeks ago, we discussed just generally what the variation and comparison procedures are, and in terms of how to interpret some of the scores that the procedures provide you. And today is going to be through the use of dyslexia. I'll be providing you an example of how you can take a condition and its underlying characteristics and kind of use that to target specific variations and comparisons of interest. Now, with that said, there is a disclaimer just to be mindful of. The disclaimer specifically relates to when we think about using variation and comparison procedures, whether it be in the context of dyslexia assessment, ADHD, dyscalculia, whatever the condition is, we need to be mindful of a few things. So when I go through today's talk, you'll see that I do some discussion around the characteristics of what dyslexia is, kind of understanding what typical areas are that you might want to assess, what some of the cognitive correlates are, and I'll define what that means in a bit, and also looking at some of the areas of strength. So kind of really thinking about how we can use our background knowledge about a given condition and those characteristics regarding the condition to really then use that to guide which variation and comparison procedures we use, because the procedures will only be as effective as our understanding of the conditions themselves. Otherwise, we might run a lot of different variations and comparisons, and in that process, we may end up getting a lot of data that may not be as pertinent to the condition we're trying to assess. Now, the other piece that I would like to highlight as well is this discussion we're going to do today is by no means trying to convey that you can just use these variations and comparisons as the sole piece to your evaluation to substantiate the presence or absence of a given condition. So the idea with that is when we think about these procedures, it's recommended that they be used as just another data point in your evaluation. They're another data point in a broader comprehensive evaluation that you are conducting. So it's really not recommended that you use one sole variation or one sole comparison to say the individual has a given condition or does not have one. So as long as we're on the same page with these disclaimers, I would like to go through some of the background information regarding dyslexia. I'll be taking you through some of the primary and secondary characteristics, in addition to talking about the cognitive correlates and possible areas of strength as well. For anyone that needs a particular reference throughout this discussion, you'll see that there are some links to resources that I found helpful, and Riverside also has available an assessment service bulletin that you can find in Riverside Score, specifically related to using the WJ4 in dyslexia assessment. So there are resources, again, embedded within the presentation, in addition to resources on Riverside Score in the Resources tab as well. And with that said, to set the foundation, I'd like to just provide a definition of what specific learning disability is. The term itself does serve as an umbrella that assumes various academic challenges, either in the areas of reading, writing, and mathematics. And we can kind of break that down even further, thinking about dyslexia. The person might have challenges with reading fluency, they might have challenges with reading decoding, they might have challenges with reading comprehension, right? So kind of thinking when we hear specific learning disabilities, it is that umbrella term that captures a lot of other conditions. And we may see that individuals may evidence specific learning challenges in response to things like perceptual disabilities, brain injuries, brain dysfunctioning in certain areas of cognitive processing. So when I talk about some of those cognitive correlates, these cognitive correlates are areas of cognitive functioning that are linked to certain areas of academic achievement. So when I talk about that brain dysfunctioning in certain areas of cognitive processing, I'm talking about cognitive correlates. Towards the right of the slide, you'll also see that I have listed exclusionary factors. So one other piece that I think is important to call out is when we're thinking about assessing for a given condition, we want to make sure that we don't become too confirmatory in our approach, because that leads to some biases where we might just be filtering in the information that seems to allude to a given condition, and we might be filtering out information that is still important that might then bring into question whether or not our assumption of that condition being there is valid or not. And that's where these exclusionary factors really should be considered and assessed. I'm kind of understanding that these factors, we need to gather enough evidence to support that the student's learning disability is not primarily the result of things like a visual, hearing, or motor impairment, an intellectual disability, an emotional disturbance, and so forth. So we want to make sure, again, that we're doing our due diligence to gather data to support a particular concern, depending on what the referral issue is. In this case, we're using dyslexia as the referral concern. And we also want to make sure that we are ruling out any of those exclusionary factors. Now, just diving a little deeper about what dyslexia is, it is one of the, if not the most common specific learning disability. We'll see that about 20% of the human population has dyslexia. About 80 to 90% of those who are identified with a specific learning disability have dyslexia, and about 40% of children with dyslexia have another area of disability. So in terms of the conditions that we come across as school-based practitioners, dyslexia is certainly one that we come across quite often, or at least it's one that individuals are referred for quite often, which is partly the reason why I'm wanting to use it today as an example of how you can select variation and comparison procedures. Just diving a little deeper into what dyslexia is, dyslexia originates from the Greek words dys and lexia. So if you roughly translate that into English, that would be impaired word. Now, depending on your locality, and by locality I mean state, you may have a different definition than the one that we use here in New York State, where I'm from. But according to the New York State DOE, they use a definition that says dyslexia refers to a learning disorder affecting a student's reading skills. And you can see that it often manifests as deficits in phonological processing, decoding, reading fluency, spelling, or inaccurate or effortful word reading. Now, again, that definition may be different depending on your locality. So if you do get a referral for dyslexia, you would want to check your educational guidance for your location to see what specific definition your locality uses for this condition. Now, we also see that dyslexia, the deficits that present are associated with brain-based phonological impairments. So again, it's not going to be based on deficits related to something like an intellectual disability or deficits related to visual problems. As I mentioned on the last slide, things like those sort of sensory impairments or disorders and the intellectual disability that someone may have, that would actually fall under those exclusionary factors. Now, when we think about dyslexia a little further, we can consider two different perspectives, either the educational or the clinical. So in terms of the educational, if we think about the New York State DOE's perspective that I just provided, in addition to organizations like the International Dyslexia Association, or the IDA, we'll see that both define dyslexia as a disorder that is brain-based or neurobiological in origin. And under the classifications that are available through federal law, if we're thinking about special education eligibility, a student can be eligible for special education due to disordered processes that are involved related to reading and or spelling. Now, if we think about more clinical settings for those that are in private practice or working in outpatient clinics or hospitals, you'll likely be using the DSM as your system. And you likely already know that a student can be diagnosed as having a specific learning disorder. See, I didn't say disability, but disorder, based on challenges related to reading accuracy, effortful and slow word reading, poor reading comprehension, and spelling challenges. Now, I had emphasized that difference between specific learning disability and specific learning disorder, and you'll see throughout the literature and even in your practice, you'll likely hear a broad range of terms that are related to notable impairments in reading and in spelling. And oftentimes what happens is both parents and professionals are often confused regarding the difference between something like a specific learning disability and dyslexia, for example. And individuals might question, if someone has a specific learning disability, do they automatically have dyslexia, for example? And the point here is, as we've noted, SLD is that broader category that encompasses several different types of disorders. So dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. The very specific characteristics that we're going to talk about today are characteristics that are specifically related to one type of specific learning disability or disorder, which would be dyslexia. Now, I do want to add one other caveat before I move forward, just to again emphasize that the characteristics we will talk about need to be documented and noted across multiple sources of data to make any sort of classification or diagnosis based on your locality's definition. In addition to that, you want to make sure that whoever is engaging in the classification or diagnostic process should have expertise related to the condition in question and expertise in terms of administering and interpreting the data from the assessments that they're using. Okay, with that point made, just to kind of bring it all together, aside from all of the various terms and different perspectives that are available when we think about dyslexia, there are some commonalities across the terms and the perspectives. So we do see that there is this view of dyslexia being a neurobiological disorder impacting foundational reading skills, spelling, and the speed and accuracy for letter-sound relationships. As I mentioned before, you also will see a commonality across the terms in terms of cognitive correlates, so deficits in cognitive areas that are related to reading and spelling, and we'll talk a bit about those. You also may see strengths that are often present in somebody's score profile, despite areas of weakness in the primary and secondary areas of reading and spelling. And one other point that I will highlight is dyslexia does have an enduring nature that all of these terms do acknowledge, that make it a very lifelong condition. But despite this piece, interventions can be used to reduce its impact on a child's functioning. All right, now that we've kind of laid the ground rules of what SLD is, what dyslexia is, I'm going to move into the primary characteristics and then the secondary characteristics, while highlighting some of the procedures that you can use as a part of your evaluation process. So here you can see some of the primary reading and writing characteristics of dyslexia. So individuals with dyslexia may present with any combination of challenges within these domains that I have listed here. So you might see individuals that have profound deficits in fluency, in basic reading skills, in spelling, and so forth. To make sure that we're all on the same page about what these primary areas are, I'm going to go through each one before I jump into the variations and comparisons. So when we think about the first primary area that was listed on that diagram, I'd listed letter-sound correspondence. As we know, reading requires full knowledge of the connections between phonemes and graphemes. Phonemes are the sounds of language, and graphemes are the printed letters that represent the sounds of language. Now, if you take a look at that diagram on the left, you'll see that knowledge of letter-sound correspondence is defined as the alphabetic principle. That alphabetic principle is the idea that letters and letter patterns represent the sounds of spoken language. Now, why might it be important to look for some fluctuations or variability within this sort of primary area for dyslexia? Well, if you look towards the right, you'll see that letter-sound correspondence, that type of knowledge, is the foundation for word identification and spelling, which on the diagram that I showed before, those are also primary characteristics or primary areas that you'd want to assess as a part of a dyslexia evaluation. In addition to this, weaknesses in letter-sound correspondence can also inform challenges with reading fluency, which is another primary area that you'd want to be mindful of in a dyslexia evaluation. Moving forward, thinking about another primary area, we have phoneme grapheme knowledge. So this is now looking at our ability to apply our knowledge of speech sounds when we're reading and spelling words. And this is an area that is commonly deficient in individuals with dyslexia. Similarly, we might also see complications in an individual's basic reading skills. So when I say basic reading skills, I'm talking about things like your sight word reading and your phonics. So sight word reading involves recognizing real words without the need to analyze the sounds or the parts of the word. In comparison, when you think about phonics, that requires you to apply your knowledge of letters and their sounds. So thinking about the use of decoding or being able to spell unfamiliar words, that would be more so your phonics application. And now thinking about our reading fluency, we would also want to consider this as another primary area of concern in a dyslexia evaluation. You can see here that reading fluency does involve being able to read words accurately with little effort, being able to maintain an appropriate reading rate or pace, and also being able to maintain an appropriate prosody. So prosody is thinking about things like the rise and fall of your voice while you're speaking, how you stress certain words and phrases based on the punctuation in the text itself, and so forth. Now, when you're thinking about assessing reading fluency, you want to be mindful that you can assess it at 3 different levels. So you can assess it at the individual word level, the syntactic unit level, and at the whole passage level. And each component of reading fluency does play a role in some of the higher order areas we'll discuss that are secondary areas of deficit for dyslexia. So for example, reading fluency is needed for the secondary area that is reading comprehension. Okay, and the last primary area I will run through is spelling. And I know I'm going through these a little quickly, but I'm going under the assumption that we all have some general understanding of what these ability areas are. So when we think about spelling, spelling demands similar knowledge to reading. When you just consider how both reading and spelling demand knowledge of letter-sound correspondence and knowledge of orthography. And orthography, if we want to define what that is, we're thinking of the spelling system that's used in a given language. Now, where spelling can be a little different and more challenging is when we start to consider how spelling requires someone to mentally segment the word that they want to spell into speech sounds or phonemes. They then have to be able to retrieve the letter that matches each specific phoneme that's a part of that word. And then they also have to implement their fine motor skills to generate the actual word itself on paper. All right, so now that I've given you all some context regarding the primary achievement areas to look out for when we think about dyslexia assessment, I'm going to briefly discuss the secondary reading and writing areas to be mindful of. Again, the reason why I'm going through this is the more of an understanding we have of the primary, secondary, whatever the characteristics are of a given condition, and in this case, we're talking about dyslexia, the better we can select tests to administer that then can be inputted into that variation and comparison procedure. So then we can actually use that data more meaningfully as a part of our evaluation. So again, if we don't really understand the condition itself, then we're not going to know what types of information we might need to look for. And then in turn, we'll have a harder time identifying specific procedures to use. So thinking about reading comprehension as one of these secondary areas, it involves both the ability to understand what somebody is reading. So the person has to understand what they're reading, in addition to being able to interpret and make inferences from what was read. So kind of thinking about surface level versus deeper forms of reading comprehension. Now, this domain is important to consider in a dyslexia assessment because many of the primary areas of functioning that I discussed before are necessary and lend themselves to effective reading comprehension. So for example, poor letter sound knowledge, poor decoding skills, poor reading rate, poor prosody, poor fluency, and so forth, all can impact a child's reading comprehension performance. I'm adding in the simple view of reading just for anyone that is listening who is not familiar with it. And it's one theory that I found to be very, very helpful in thinking about the skills that contribute to early reading comprehension skills. So if you're not familiar with this theory, the simple view of reading states that reading comprehension ability is determined by the interaction between someone's decoding skills. So now we're thinking about the ability to accurately and fluently decode written words and their language comprehension skills, which would lend themselves to being able to understand the meaning of written text. If we think about those two elements and we look at the top left-hand kind of quadrant, we'll see that dyslexia is listed there. And dyslexic individuals under this theory are characterized by poor word level skills and good language comprehension. And those word level skills that are poor can include poor reading and poor spelling skills. So poor reading, decoding, and poor spelling skills. Now, the reason why I bring up this dynamic is because when we get towards the end of today's talk, I'm going to bring up some comparisons that can be run, such as the oral language to achievement comparison. And if we keep in mind that under this theory, individuals tend to have poor word level skills when compared to good language comprehension, that oral language to achievement comparison can be run to see if the individual's oral language skills, which would include things like their language comprehension, if those skills are commensurate with their reading achievement. So that comparison would be a good way to see if your examinee aligns with that dyslexic profile based on this simple view of reading. And again, we wouldn't want to use that one comparison and say, yes, because this theory says that's dyslexia, my client has dyslexia. We wouldn't want to say that, but what that comparison can do is provide us with another data point or another piece of evidence to support that diagnosis or that classification. All right, and then the last secondary area that I'll mention today is written expression. Written expression is something you would want to be mindful of because you can see that it is impacted by primary areas of complication, so such as spelling and phoneme grapheme knowledge, in addition to some of the secondary areas that I mentioned as well, like reading comprehension. So to elaborate on that, deficits in phoneme grapheme knowledge and spelling can impact your examinee's accuracy, their speed, and their clarity when they're writing longer prose. Furthermore, if we think about reading comprehension and written expression, the individual is going to have a very difficult time understanding what they've written if they have poor reading comprehension skills, right? So they'll have a difficult time maybe with organization, maybe with the actual content of what was written, if their reading comprehension skills are poor. Now, keeping this in mind, we then can start to think about some variations that we can potentially use. So if we have an understanding of those primary and secondary areas that I just ran through, we can start to isolate specific procedures to employ. Now you'll notice that the primary and secondary areas that I mentioned were in reading and in writing. They were in achievement in terms of the broader domain. So we can think about using the WJ4 Achievement's intra-achievement variation procedure to investigate fluctuations in our examinee's performance across those primary and secondary areas that I just went through. As a reminder, for those who were not in attendance 2 weeks ago, what these procedures do is they analyze the variability across the achievement test that you administer, and they could also analyze variability across clusters within the WJ4 achievement. And that can be very helpful because then you can see if there are any clinically and/or statistically significant strengths that your examinee has personally, or any weaknesses that they have personally in relation to those primary and secondary areas of dyslexia. Another variation to consider, and this is where some of these additional resources could come into play when you're engaging in your evaluation. Proctor and others, and I have the assessment bulletin linked at the bottom left-hand side of the slide. What they talk about is how individuals with dyslexia commonly evidence this pattern in which they have higher scores on tasks of academic applications, so applied academic skills. Then they tend to have their academic fluency skills fall under that, with academic skills or basic academic skills being the least developed. So to kind of reiterate, when we're thinking about some other variations that we can use, there is a specific variation procedure called the academic skills, academic fluency, academic applications variation that allows you to compare performance across 3 specific WJ4 achievement clusters. It uses the academic skills cluster, so that's tapping basic academic skills across reading, writing, and math. It includes the academic fluency cluster, which looks at overall academic fluency across reading, writing, and math. And it also includes the academic applications cluster, and that's tapping problem solving and reasoning skills in reading, writing, and math. So by using this particular procedure and using previous literature, such as Proctor and others, we can see if that pattern that dyslexic individuals tend to evidence, which again would be academic applications being the highest in terms of score, academic fluency being in the middle, academic skills being the least developed, we can use a variation procedure like this to see if that pattern holds true. And again, we're not saying because that pattern holds true, the individual has dyslexia, but it can just be another data point to help us support a diagnosis or classification of that given condition. Right, so with that said, once we kind of think about the primary and secondary areas, we also want to think about the cognitive correlates of dyslexia as well. So when we think about those cognitive correlates, these are related to cognitive or psychological processes that are linked to specific areas of achievement. And what I'm going to be talking about today are correlates related to reading, related to spelling, that can impact that student's ability to perform academically. And I like to use a visual like this when we're thinking about the academic skills that are on the surface, the skills that we see the client present with in the classroom, in comparison to some of the underlying areas that might be related to cognitive or language-related weaknesses that we may not necessarily be tapping directly in the classroom, but those areas still are very important because they lend themselves to academic success in those given areas. So in this case, we're going to go through some of the cognitive areas that are linked to reading and spelling success. And firstly, and I think this will come to no surprise to anyone, is the investigation of phonological processing and reading achievement. And when we think about what phonological processing is, we have to remember that it's the ability to perceive and manipulate speech sounds. So if we want to break that down and think about how it relates to reading achievement itself, in terms of perception to read, a student has to be able to understand that speech is comprised of phonemes, and then they have to be able to identify the distinct speech sounds in language. That's where that understanding of speech sounds comes from. The other critical piece is that manipulation of speech sounds. So this might be how the person applies their understanding of speech sounds through a task that involves maybe segmentation, where they have to break speech sounds apart, break words apart based on their speech sounds, or blending, where they have to piece phonemes together to form a word. And in this domain of functioning plays a big role in reading achievement. And I'll break this down just a little bit more for you all. So I just started talking about segmentation and sound blending, and these are two areas that you can tap using the WJ4. And these are areas that you would likely want to tap because they're two significant skills that are related to early reading and spelling success. When we think about blending, it serves as a foundation for phonics skill development, or again, that ability, for example, to decode unfamiliar words. Whereas segmentation is very foundational for spelling skills. As we know, segmentation plays a big role in its ability to sequence sounds to spell words correctly. So if you have trouble segmenting, you're likely going to have some trouble spelling words as well. Some other domains that you also can tap that fall under phonological processing are tasks that involve some other phoneme manipulation kind of elements. So thinking about deletion and thinking about substitution. These are areas that are thought to be more sensitive measures of reading skill development when compared to segmentation and sound blending. And in part, that's because they require multiple intact skills. So you'll see here that in order to engage in deletion tasks or substitution tasks, you need to be able to segment, you need to be able to blend, and you need to be able to isolate phonemes as well. Now, with that understanding of phonological processing being so core in terms of how it relates to reading achievement, there are some variation procedures and comparison procedures that may be of interest to an examiner. So when we think about the procedures that are available to you, if you are an individual who only has the WJ4 oral language, or you only have the WJ4 cog, what I'm about to provide to you via this slide will be very applicable to you. So if we conduct an intraoral language variation, and we see to the left that that requires at least tests 1 through 4, and we would also want to consider adding into that procedure test 7, because if we take a look at the WJ4 oral language, test 3 is related to segmentation, test 7 is related to sound blending, which are areas that I just mentioned as being underneath that umbrella of phonological processing. So we can use those two tests within an intraoral language variation procedure to see if the person's performance on tests that tap those skills are clinically and statistically significant in terms of where their other oral language skills are. To rephrase that a little bit, for those of you that were not here 2 weeks ago, what these procedures do is they look at a person's performance on a given test, and their performance is compared to how well they did on average in other areas within the same battery. Now, for those of you that only have the WJ4 cog, what you can do is something similar. You can choose to then administer the test related to auditory processing that the WJ4 cog provides. So for example, you would look at phonological processing, you would look at non-word repetition, and you would be able to look for, again, those fluctuations, trying to see if their performance on those tests is notably weak or is a personal weakness for them. And that gives you, again, another data point to try to determine if this person may have dyslexia. Now, I will offer one word of caution, because phonological processing is one of those areas where your student might have reading and spelling challenges in the classroom, and they might have average phonological processing when you administer some of these tests. Now, if you have not done so in your assessment up to that point, you want to review their academic history. You want to see if there were any academic interventions that were used to support phonological processing. Those skills can be particularly malleable when they're worked on in isolation. So for example, if you're working on segmenting sounds, then moving on to blending sounds, So because they can be so malleable and amenable to change, we have to be mindful that good phonological processing doesn't automatically mean that the child is not eligible for a dyslexia classification or a dyslexia diagnosis. So to reiterate, just make sure you check that person's academic history for any interventions or external supports that they may have engaged in. Now, another variation that you can run if you have both the WJ4-COG and the WJ4 oral language are extended variations. So with access to both test batteries, you can do a WJ4 intracognitive variation that also includes some of the oral language tests. Now you might be asking, what's the significance of doing that? Well, if you decide to run that cognitive variation and pull in oral language test, what ends up happening is now those oral language tests that you're pulling in are being compared to your examinee's average performance on other areas of cognitive ability. In comparison to that, if you are more interested in looking at a language skill comparison, you would use the WJ4 oral language. You would use that extended variation procedure to compare their phonological processing skills to their average performance on other measures of oral language. And lastly, one other consideration if we're thinking about comparisons, which are different than variations, is thinking about using the GFGC composite to predict how well your examinee should do in the domain of auditory processing and phonetic coding. This comparison is one that might be helpful if we're noticing that the examinee has some sort of profound weakness on a test that's used to predict their performance when you're running these variations that I mentioned here. So for example, if I notice if I'm using the WJ4-COG and my examinee has a profound weakness, say on test 3 of the WJ4-COG, that profound weakness is going to play a role in that procedure when I'm looking at phonological processing and non-word repetition. So if I'm trying to get around that, particularly knowing that those with SLD tend to have challenges with lower order tasks like cognitive processing speed, working memory, to get around that, I can use a GFGC composite instead as a predictor because it only incorporates higher order cognitive functions in fluid reasoning and comprehension knowledge. And I can see if the individual's reasoning skills map on or are consumerant with their auditory processing and phonetic coding abilities to areas that are related to phonological processing. So this can give me another way to think about if the person has some concerns in those cognitive correlates related to phonological processing. All right, moving right along, thinking about some other areas we would want to be concerned about in terms of our assessment. I talked a lot about phonology just now. Now it's really important to also think about orthography as well, because both domains can be impaired in dyslexia. And we do have to also remember that orthography is something that's needed for spelling success. And if you remember, spelling is a primary area of concern for dyslexia assessment. So when we think about orthographic processing, orthographic processing is very important. It lends itself to the ability to read and write symbols. So symbols can include things like letters, letter patterns, numbers, and punctuation marks. And it is a skill that demands memory. So orthographic processing requires that you have to be able to picture and recall the symbol in question. You need to be able to hold it in your immediate awareness. And you need to be able to use that retrieved information to either read what's provided to you or spell something that's asked of you. Now, this is important when we think about dyslexia because it's what helps us to easily recall and use specific word patterns. So when we think about sight word reading, for example, this comes into play and is very helpful in that process. And once these symbols are committed to memory, We also can see that it's helpful for things like reading fluency and spelling as well, because orthographic processing lends itself to proper pronunciation of text and also proper spelling of words. So this is another cognitive correlate to be mindful of. And you might be asking, okay, what specifically can I do to look at fluctuations related to this area? Well, we can think about a couple of different options. So if we think about looking at fluctuations within the WJ4 achievement or within the WJ4 cog, for those of you that have either or, when we're thinking about the WJ4 achievement, we would want to think about how, because orthographic processing is related to pronunciation and spelling skills, we can choose to review test 1 of the achievement, which requires reading letters and words, test 3, which is spelling, that's requiring the writing of letters and words, and we could look at test 7 of the WJ4 achievement as well, which is a word attack, looking at reading nonsense words. So if you only have the achievement, you might run that intra-achievement variation and look to see if there are any fluctuation. So thinking about maybe significant weaknesses for your examinee, to give some credence to if there might be an orthographic processing concern. Now, what I would do is I would couple that, if you have both the achievement and the cog, I would couple that with the WJ4 COGS intra-cognitive variation procedure. Because again, the achievement tests are going to look more like what the individual is doing in school. The cognitive tests are going to be more aligned with some of those underlying abilities. So I would always recommend in this case to use that WJ4 COG intra-cog variation in thinking about using the 2 tests that involve quickly and accurately identifying symbols. We have 2 of those tests on the cog, thinking of letter pattern matching, and then we also have number pattern matching as well. So we're thinking about, can this individual quickly and accurately identify letters, letter groups, and can this individual quickly and accurately identify numbers? So you could look at fluctuations on the achieve and then look to see if there are also fluctuations on the cog, and that can give you a very good understanding of whether or not orthographic processing might be something impaired for your client. Now, alternatively, you do also have the option, going back to using the GFGC composite as a predictor, you can decide to use that composite to see if the person's overall reasoning skills and abilities are commensurate to their perceptual speed. Now, that particular cluster is comprised of those same 2 tests I mentioned on the previous slide, thinking about letter pattern matching and number pattern matching. So this comparison will give us an idea to see if the person's estimated overall intelligence is aligned with their orthographic processing skills. If you notice that their orthographic processing skills are significantly below where their overall reasoning skills are, that might give you another data point to really make sense of whether that cognitive correlate of orthographic processing is possibly related to the achievement concerns your client might be presenting with. All right, so now I'm going to run through just a few more cognitive correlates to be mindful of, and I'll mention at the end of this discussion of these correlates some comparisons just to be mindful of. So an additional correlate to think about is rapid naming. Rapid naming, when we think about it, is related to your speed of lexical access. So thinking about how quickly and how accurately you can recall names of objects and symbols. If we think about it, rapid naming tasks and your speed of lexical access is very much so related to reading. When you think about these rapid naming tests, they often, similarly to reading tasks, demand a person to quickly synthesize verbal and visual information. In addition to this piece, that fluent integration of visual and verbal data, in addition to being able to hone your attention, all of that's needed for successful reading. So with that said, if somebody is facing challenges in this area of rapid naming, you might see challenges in reading accuracy and reading rate and reading comprehension. And for very young children, this particular area is a good marker of who will struggle with reading fluency later. So because of this predictive relationship, because of how closely related it can be to your primary characteristics of reading, this is a cognitive correlate you would want to assess and look for when you're administering the WJ4. We also would want to be mindful of short-term working memory. Short-term working memory lends itself to reading development and achievement because in order to read, we need to be able to hold information in our awareness, and we need to be able to manipulate that information to achieve some sort of goal. So if you think about reading comprehension, for example, if you have trouble retaining important information in a text that's needed to understand and answer questions about it, you're likely going to then struggle on a task of reading comprehension. So this is another area here that we want to be mindful of assessing when we are engaged in a dyslexia assessment. Staying within short-term working memory, we want to be mindful of your auditory memory span as well, asking the question of how much information can my examinee hold in their awareness? And this is important because a limited span can impact how much you can retain in terms of what you read. So the more information you can hold at one time, the more information you have to work with to determine the gist of what was read. So again, this is another area that would be important if you're also thinking about concerns related to reading comprehension. And then we have cognitive processing speed. I think we all are familiar with this domain. And this has been described as a sensitive but not specific characteristic of a broad range of disorders that are common to childhood. In terms of reading, we could think about you needing processing speed because without it, reading can be less automatic. And if something is less automatic, you need to allocate more mental resources and effort to make up for the lack of your efficient ability to read. And what that does is it limits your resources for more advanced tasks, like reading comprehension, for example. Now, the WJ4 cog does have, and I'll highlight how you can use this in a comparison procedure in a moment. It does have a cognitive efficiency cluster, and this is designed to be a diagnostic index that can be helpful to give you an idea of how a student's overall processing and memory compares to their peers, but also compares to their own abilities as well. So when I talk about the comparison on the next slide, I'll be talking about how you can compare this efficiency cluster to their own abilities as well. But why is this important? Well, if we already mentioned that having poor cognitive processing speed is not helpful for your reading success, and having poor working memory is not helpful for your reading success. So having low cognitive efficiency, which brings both of those areas together, that's going to make speeded and advanced reading tasks that much more challenging for your examinee, which is why it's another cognitive correlate to be mindful of. Now, when we think about comparisons that can be run, we can think about using the GFGC to other ability comparisons to look at all of the areas that I just mentioned in terms of those cognitive correlates. So that speed of lexical access or rapid naming, short-term working memory, auditory working memory span, all of those pieces can be assessed or at least compared to someone's overall reasoning abilities. I'll mention in a little bit that when we look at a person's reasoning skills and knowledge, generally speaking, that tends to be intact when the individual is struggling with other issues related to dyslexia, whereas some of the areas to the right may be impaired or may be deficient. So using a comparison like this can help you to see, is the person's overall reasoning and knowledge intact in comparison to these other areas that tend to be problematic for individuals with dyslexia. Now, with that said, I know we only have a little bit of time left, so hopefully I can get through my last few slides. I do want to talk a little bit about the ability to learn independent of reading. Going back to that idea of individuals with dyslexia, when we're thinking about our evaluation, we want to make sure that it's well-rounded, And to do so, we would want to not only look for areas that may be deficient, cognitive correlates, but also the areas that may be strong or at least intact for those particular students. And that's what we are going to discuss now. So according to Shaywitz, who you may know is a prominent figure in dyslexia, dyslexic students have a sea of strengths. I mean, you can see a lot of the strengths listed here. These abilities are considered to be independent of the areas commonly impacted in dyslexia, and because of this, they may present as strengths in their profile. Now, to reiterate what I mentioned before, these strengths can be evident despite having performances that are disrupted or deficient in those primary, secondary, and cognitive correlate areas that we've discussed today. Now, using the 3WJ4 batteries, the cog, the achievement, and the oral language, examiners can identify strengths in these particular areas. And you can use these possible areas of strength as predictors of performance in those areas of reading, achievement, and you can also look at some of the more basic writing skills like spelling, and that can be helpful to uncover a pattern of scores that can give you evidence towards a dyslexia diagnosis or classification. So firstly speaking, we can think about general intelligence. General intelligence is an area that may be intact for individuals who are suspected of having dyslexia. And when we think about the WJ4, we have the general intellectual ability, intellectual composite, that's based on the test 1 through 7. Now, one thing I will call out about this particular composite is that it's based on a differential weighting. So each of those 7 tests contribute differently to the GIA score. To be more specific, tests that tap abilities that are more closely related to that general intelligence factor or that G factor, like fluid reasoning, for example, would contribute more to a student's GIA score when compared to lower order tests. So something like processing speed, for example, would be considered lower order. Nonetheless, all 7 of those tests contribute something to the overall score. And that's important to keep in mind because individuals with dyslexia might show weaknesses in those lower order domains. And as such, that GIA score might be attenuated and as such may not be the best predictor of what that person can do academically. But if you notice that there is not significant attenuation based on your clinical judgment, one of the comparisons that you can use is the GIA composite as a predictor for academic achievement in several areas, and I've included some of the areas of reading and writing here. This procedure that's listed here would be more so aligned with localities that use the discrepancy model, kind of seeing if there's a notable discrepancy between an individual's IQ and academic achievement. But there's also some utility in it as well as another data point, even for those of you that are using more of a patterns of strengths and weaknesses approach. So again, this comparison is using that GIA, which is thought of to be a area that's relatively or could be relatively untouched, to use it as a predictor of performance in areas of academic achievement that may be impacted due to dyslexia. Now, I'd also mentioned about the fact that reasoning and knowledge may be intact as well in a person's score profile. And we can think about using the GFGC composite as a predictor here. That GFGC composite is super helpful, especially if you realize that your examinee demonstrates some sort of significant deficits in one or more of those lower order domains of functioning. So if you're noticing that the GIA might be brought down by really significantly low working memory or processing speed, and you're concerned about that GIA being the best predictor of what the person can do academically, you would want to consider using the GFGC, and that's because it only is comprised of tests that fall under the fluid reasoning domain and the comprehension knowledge domain. So you don't have to worry too much about attenuation of the composite itself based on performances on lower order areas. And that comparison that you'd want to consider is the GFGC to achievement comparison. This one uses the GFGC as that predictor score. And as you can see here, there's a broad array of reading and writing domains that you can use the GFGC composite as a predictor for. So to kind of rephrase that differently, you can use this to help determine if their overall reasoning and knowledge skills are relatively intact and commensurate with their academic achievement in those areas listed here. For those of you who are more so interested in looking at more of a patterns of strengths and weaknesses approach, those of you that are not necessarily looking for a discrepancy per se, this particular comparison that I have listed here will be of interest to you. Unlike the GIA and the GFGC, this comparison between scholastic aptitude and achievement areas specifically is looking for consistency. Now you might be saying, how is it looking for consistency if it's still including COG tests to academic performance? Well, in the WJ4 COG manual, you'll see that there is a table that looks like the one to the left here. And you'll notice that these particular clusters that are called scholastic aptitude clusters, they're specifically designed to serve as the best measures of aptitude for specific areas of achievement. And you'll notice that there will be differences in how those aptitude clusters are comprised. So if you take a look at basic reading skills, you'll see that basic reading skills, that particular aptitude cluster for the COG, which uses test 1, 3, 5, and 11, that's different than the COG tests that are used to predict reading rate, which you see here at test 1, 5, 9, and 11. So depending on the academic area that is to be predicted or compared to, the scholastic aptitude clusters themselves, they will vary to give you the best estimate of what the person should be able to do in that academic area. All right, just speeding along, I did mention before when we talked a little bit about the simple view of reading, about how for dyslexic individuals, we might see their verbal comprehension being quite high and their word reading kind of processing being quite low. And just to circle back to that point, we're now thinking about this oral language piece, thinking about how, aside from those cognitive clusters to academic achievement, could also consider a person's oral language skills. Oral language tends to be an area that's generally intact when compared to a dyslexic student's reading achievement and spelling and written expression skills. So we could use the oral language to achievement comparisons listed here to use the broad oral language cluster to predict how the person is expected to perform in these, say, reading areas here, for example. And again, what this does is this provides us with another data point to help make a determination of SLD. And then lastly, since I know I'm coming up just on the last minute, so thank you all for sticking with me, is talking a little bit about general academic knowledge as well. This is another area that tends to be intact when we consider a dyslexic profile. And the general academic knowledge cluster is one that uses the last 3 tests of the WJ4 achievement in the extended battery, science, social studies, and humanities. And it's specifically a language-based academic cluster. And it's thought to be a really great measure of GC. And with that, we can have that expectation that students with high general academic knowledge tend to be ones that we expect to have high intact reading skills as well. So because of that assumption, we can use the academic knowledge to achievement comparisons to compare an individual's academic knowledge, that's sampling from the last 3 achieve tests, to their performance on other areas of academic achievement within the achievement itself. Now, I know I ran through stuff really quickly towards the end because I wanted to try to get it all in. But hopefully, if there is time for questions, I'm more than happy to answer if people are still around and have some. So I will now turn it back over to my colleagues at Riverside to let me know if there are any questions that need further clarification.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. We don't have any that I think require your attention, but I would like to thank you and our attendees for coming today. We appreciate the amazing presentation and really valuable information that you shared about how using the referral question can help guide our selection of the most relevant variation and comparison procedures to include in our data analysis. And again, thank you everyone for attending. We are out of time, but please be sure to stay tuned for other professional development opportunities. Dr. Grant is going to do a third installment in the Variation and Comparison Procedures webinar series, talking about how we use the results of the variation and comparison procedures to guide our instructional programming and recommendations for students. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you everyone again, and see you all again soon.